Everybody, welcome to Chapter 8. We're going to be talking about the overall nervous system. So there's two major subdivisions of the nervous system. You have the central nervous system and then you have the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes your brain and your spinal cord. This is going to take information coming in, interpret and integrate that information, and then send it out too as well. Peripheral nervous system is what's going to sort of bring it into the brain and spinal cord and take it out from the spinal cord. Now, the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system can be further divided into a somatic, which would receive sensory information from your skin, even your muscles can send sensory info, and then it's going to direct voluntary movements. It's going to direct voluntary movements. That's a key term because autonomic is going to direct what's called involuntary movements. And that autonomic gets further divided into your sympathetic. This is usually called your fight or flight response. And then your parasympathetic, which is usually during your resting and digesting type of moments. And we'll talk about these systems individually in a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some things that protect the central nervous system. So the bones of the skull and the vertebral column, we had seen those in lab. There is connective tissue membranes that also form a protective layer around the brain and the spinal cord. These are called meninges. Their outermost layer is going to be the dura, which is a really, really strong connective tissue. You're then going to have an arachnoid mater, and then you're going to have a pia mater. Looks like I forgot to add mater after that. And so going from outermost to innermost, okay, this is going to go dura, arachnoid, and pia. Now, circulating in the subarachnoid space, so between the arachnoid and the pia mater, is going to be what's called cerebral spinal fluid. And this is going to protect the CNS and spinal cord. It's going to support it structurally, providing maybe a shock absorption, and it's going to also provide nourishment and waste removal. It is circulated from your plasma. So we get it from your plasma, and then we send it back to your plasma. Now, you can get inflammation of your meninges, that is called meningitis, okay? And then they can also test for it by taking a sample of your cerebral spinal fluid to test if it's a bacterial or a viral meningitis, which can lead to potential serious issues such as death. Now, the blood-brain barrier, so the capillaries that go to your brain, there is very tight junctions, which when you think of tight junction, you think of an almost impermeable barrier. This blood-brain barrier basically says when the blood delivers plasma with nutrients to your brain, there is this selective filter that says this can go in and this cannot go in. And so a lot of things that are lipid soluble can easily pass through, but our body likes to prevent things that could be just circulating in our bloodstream from getting into our central nervous system due to the importance of it. So that blood-brain barrier acts as a selective filter by selecting certain things from the plasma to bring into the CSF and into nutrients into the cells of the brain. And looking here, we're just looking at an image right here. This is showing you the meninges. It's also showing the flow of CSF. So CSF is actually made in ventricles, which are on the center part of the brain here. And so it's made in here, and then it makes its way out and circulates all around the brain and all around the spinal cord. All right, so the cerebrum, this is basically this top portion here of your brain. This is your cerebrum. This is the conscious part of your brain. It's the biggest part of your brain. It's divided into two hemispheres. So here we're looking at what's called a sagittal cut. So you can see that from this image. So we're looking at the left side of the brain here. And so this is divided into two hemispheres, so a right and a left hemisphere. And each hemisphere will receive information from different parts of the body. So depending, some parts of the right hemisphere will receive information from some parts of the left side of the body. And the left hemisphere will receive information from some parts of the right side of the body. That's why when someone has a stroke, you commonly see that they have impairment on the opposite side there. There is a thin layer around the brain known as the cerebral cortex. And so I can't really see it from this image here, but if you can imagine a thin layer, okay, a thin layer of what's called gray matter, okay, and then mostly what's in here is going to be white matter. You can see actually a white matter right here in this corpus callosum. And basically the gray matter has cell bodies in it, and this is where most of your synapses are going to have. And your white matter is white because it's myelinated. And this is where most of your tracts are going to run. So you can see here we have the corpus callosum, and this corpus callosum is a really important structure. It actually what allows myelinated tracts so the right hemisphere can communicate with the left hemisphere. A lot of times there is some procedures that cut those fibers in there, and that prevents seizures in there. Now, the brain can be divided into various functional areas. So if we go ahead and look at this right here, we have learned about these lobes in lab. So you have your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, and your temporal lobe. And pretty much from here forward is motor, and then back here is all sensory. So the brain is a little bit more predominantly sensory. It will get further divided into other areas too as well. And so if we look at right here, this is looking at this green portion on both sides. This is called your primary somatosensory area. And this receives sensory from the body, and it's kind of cool. This is called a sensory homunculus, this weird looking individual right here. And the reason certain structures are bigger than others is because they're represented more spatially in the brain. So basically, if you think about which areas have more sensation, thinking about your cheeks, your nose, your lips, your teeth, your gums, your fingers, think about which would hurt more if you got stabbed. Would you rather get stabbed in your hip, or would you rather get stabbed in your eye? Probably your hip, because there's less sensory representation. Now we have the same thing on the other side for motor. So here's your motor cortexes right here. And this primary motor area, this is, if you look at the bigger representation, think about having more intricate control of these areas. Okay, now we have some other areas. We have what's called, let me get to a picture here. I'm going to go right back to this picture. You have this in the notes here, but I'm just going to go right to this image and talk about all the functional areas here. And so first we're going to talk about is the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to take sensory information coming up from the spinal cord. It's going to pass through this region, which we'll talk about in a minute, called the brainstem. And all sensory is going to synapse in the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to say, okay, your vision, you go here to the occipital lobe. Okay, your hearing, you go to the temporal lobe. Your general sensory, you go to the parietal lobe. So it's going to kind of process all this sensory information that's coming in. The only one it doesn't is smell. Smell is old brain, actually. All right, so the next thing that we have is what's called the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is this region right here. The hypothalamus is just such an important structure for how small it is. I mean, it controls things from food intake, rage, emotion, temperature control, heart rate, blood pressure, a lot of different functions. It even coordinates control of what's called the pituitary gland, which is your major endocrine organ there. And so we also have here in this view, we have what's called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, just to kind of summarize it up, it's balance and posture. And so it coordinates sensory and motor voluntary movement. So basically when you lift your leg up, your cerebellum is what helps you control so you don't fall over. So when you lift your leg up, you're flexing on one side, you would stimulate your extensors on the other side so you don't fall over. That's the job of your cerebellum. It also has some learned motor patterns, some memory patterns, like they think like doing puzzles has a lot to do with your cerebellum. The brainstem. So the brainstem here, we have what's called the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. And so the midbrain is kind of just like a relay station between cerebellum, spinal cord. So you have information coming up and coming down through the brainstem. You also have information going in and out of the cerebellum. So this is just kind of like an intake zone. And then also too, the pons is really that job too as well. It's just kind of taking in information from lower areas and taking information from upper areas. Now, the biggest one that we have is the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata, sorry, my pen is acting up. The medulla oblongata, this controls your autonomic centers for heart rate and digestion. It doesn't mention it here, but it's a big player in cardiovascular and respiratory adjustment. So heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing rates, respiration rates. It does relay information back and forth through the thalamus there, but it's really your biggest controller of heart rate and respiratory rate. Okay, now there is an area in here called the limbic system, and the limbic system is your emotional brain. I'm going to go to this image right here. This limbic system, it's part of your old brain. So when we think about how we're related to previous earlier man, this limbic system was fully developed. Your hippocampus specifically, this one is involved with long-term and short-term memory. The amygdala is also involved too with that. But if you can think of one thing when thinking about the limbic system, you'd be thinking about the emotional brain. So anger, fear, rage, sexual desire, those types of things. Now, there's something shown in here in green, and it's not labeled, but this green thing is called the reticular activating system. And so this reticular activating system is just a bunch of networks of neurons that runs through the medulla oblongata, and it goes up through the brainstem, and then it goes up to the cerebral cortex. And it basically kind of like filters sensory input. So basically it sorts out what's important and what's not important. So for example, if you wear a watch, your brain isn't always like, I'm wearing a watch, I'm wearing a watch, I'm wearing a watch, I'm wearing a watch. It can sort of filter that out so you can focus on more important things. And that is called the reticular activating system. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, you learn the structure of the spinal cord. And this you can see right here, you've got this sort of butterfly appearance of gray matter, and it's surrounded by white matter. And the spinal cord is going to be your major sort of pathway to get information from out here. It comes in, and then it goes up to the brain there. So it's going to be kind of like a relay. It also serves as an important reflex center. And so let's talk about a reflex. You have many videos that I provided that show you what a reflex arc is. And so let's say you step on a nail. And so you step on a nail, that message would come into the spinal cord. It would synapse on an interneuron, and then it would contract on your quadriceps femoris in order to bring that knee up and out. Now, information would eventually get up to the brain, but you want this to happen nice and quickly. That is a reflex. Shining light into someone's eye and seeing their pupil constrict, their pupil is that black dot, that is also a reflex too as well. So these are the components of a reflex arc. Okay, now looking at the next thing that we have here, we have parts of the spinal cord here. We have what's called cranial nerves, and we have what's called spinal nerves. There's 12 pairs of cranial nerves, so there's 12 pairs, and then there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves that are coming out levels of the spinal cord. Now, these would conduct, the spinal nerve specifically would conduct information coming in from, let's say, this is your hand over here, okay? So you'd have a nerve coming from there. It would come in. Let's say this is sensory, comes in. It synapses in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and then goes up to the brain. Messages would come down, synapse on the ventral horn. It would go back out, and that would be motor. Sensory goes into the spinal cord. Motor information comes out of it. Your spinal nerves are predominantly mixed nerves, so they have both sensory and motor. Your cranial nerves, these emerge from the brain. They can be either sensory, motor, or mixed, and you can see their different areas to where they attend to. Okay, so looking at the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system, you have what's called the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So somatic nervous system is your voluntary type of movements. This is going to gain sensory information from your skin and skeletal, and then it's going to send information out specifically only to skeletals, because skeletal is voluntary movement. Autonomic is going to be controlling things like your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and glands, things that are out of our control. This gets further divided into two systems. You have your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight. This secretes neurotransmitters like adrenaline and noradrenaline, commonly called epinephrine and norepinephrine. And parasympathetic is going to be your more rest and digest. And so you're going to see these antagonistic-like effects. So antagonistic means opposite. And you can see here they stimulate the same organs. So this is parasympathetic right here, and this is sympathetic. You can see they both stimulate the heart, but sympathetic would increase heart rate, whereas parasympathetic would decrease it towards its normal levels. Parasympathetic is rest and digest, so that would increase digestion, whereas sympathetic, when you're running from a tiger in this adrenaline rush, you would want to inhibit your digestion there. Respiration rate would increase on this side. Respiration rate would decrease on that side. Okay, and then this is just showing you guys what I was talking about with the detail there for each of those. All right, so a little bit here on headaches, some common disorders here, and you guys can read about that in your lecture notes. Thank you.